So welcome again to our Leadership Dialogue series. We are community and membership subcommittee. We work to address challenges and concern of our fellow early career scientists by creating and facilitating team building activities, networking possibilities across early career leadership program cohorts member. Our subcommittee is organizing this Leadership Dialogue series to highlight the role of effective leadership in research academia. The goal of Leadership Dialogue series is to invite, recognize science leaders from academia and industries, and we want them to speak about what being a leader means to them. And the questions are going to attribute on the need of being an effective leader in science. We plan to make these discussions and these sessions accessible through YouTube to early career scientists, not just in GSA or within GSA, but across the globe. And that's why we are promoting leadership and more positivity across academic practices. And moreover, our aim is also to promote discussions for good leadership, and that should greatly impact the overall growth of early career researchers, but also the scientific culture in our universities and labs. So here we have our next speaker, and I would like to invite Lynn to introduce our esteemed speaker today.
Thanks, Gosha. So before introducing our speaker, I want to first introduce myself. So I'm Lynn, a PhD candidate from the University of Lausanne and also the co-chair of the Community and Membership Engagement Subcommittee of the GSA. So we are delighted to present our guest today, Dr. Needhi Bhalla. Needhi did her PhD research in the Murray lab at UCSF using budding yeast to understand mitotic chromosome segregation. She completed her postdoc at UC Berkeley in the Dernburg lab, investigating the physical organization of genetic information within chromosomes and genomes. She now has her own lab at the University of California in Santa Cruz with the research question, what are the mechanisms that ensure fidelity during meiotic and mitotic chromosome segregation? Besides, she did outreach activities to promote diversity, equity, and inclusivity in academic science. That's why she is an ideal candidate for this series. Thanks, Needhi, to come for today's session.
I'm excited to be here.
So thanks again, Needhi, for joining us. And we have prepared a set of questions for you where we think our community can get benefited by listening to your experiences and advice how to build effective leadership and how to really identify a good leader. And I would like to invite now Lishu to start this question with her first question, actually.
Hi, Dr. Bhalla. My name is Lishu. I'm a graduate student at the University of Arizona, and I'm also a member of the subcommittee that's running this series. So I guess we'll just start with a very overarching type of question. What does leadership in academic research mean to you specifically?
Thank you, Lishu. I think academic science, so I think leadership and academic research, I mean, I think it can mean lots of different things. And so I think what it means is that someone needs to think deeply about what kind of science they want to do, how they communicate their science, and how they train the next generation of scientists, and whether that means that they want to change parts of that, or if they want to, buttress or strengthen other parts of that. And so I think leadership can look like a lot of different things. And it requires someone to be aware and honest about the things that are important to them, the things that they think need to stay the same or need to be strengthened, and what needs to change. And that the way that they do science reflects that awareness and that honesty, so that they can feel good and they can feel okay about how they do science and represent themselves in science and represent themselves as a leader in science.
Wow. Well, if I may ask next question, I'm Irina Yushenova as a member, same subcommittee and research scientist as well. So the science nowadays is extremely competitive. And as a principal investigator, you have to make sure that your lab is successful and productive. But yet graduate students and postdocs are interested to finish up their term as soon as possible and just seek personal success. So how do you align the goals of your laboratory group with the goals of individual lab members?
I think the most important thing to do that is transparency, because I think the reality is that those goals have to align, because a person who is working in a lab needs to feel good and valued in that lab. But the PI also needs to recognize that there are goals and long-term goals that they need to maintain and achieve in order to keep the lab running for the next trainee that wants to come after this trainee has, for example, graduated or left for their next position. And so I think that recognition that those goals need to align, but that individuals may have not necessarily competing, but different timelines for what those goals might look like, just means that both the trainee needs to be transparent and honest about what they're hoping to get out of their position in the lab and what their timeline looks like and what their goals for their training looks like. And so that takes some awareness and self-awareness from the trainee. But that also means that the PI needs to, one, foster a relationship where the trainee feels like they can have these conversations in an honest way. And two, that the PI articulates that when we're talking about the lab, we're not only talking about the lab, for the 2 to 5 years that this trainee is going to be in the lab. We're also talking about the lab in the context of, okay, how are we laying the groundwork? How are we laying the foundation for the next trainee who will either be building on that person's work or we're starting a new project that comes out of that person's work. And so I think there needs to be a recognition that there may be conflicting timelines and conflicting priorities, but that having an honest and aware conversation about those priorities can allow people to identify areas where there's alignment and areas where maybe there needs to be honesty and transparency about the variations in the priorities and how they can eventually be aligned. Does that answer your question, or is that?
Absolutely, thank you.
Yeah, actually regarding that, like, as you said, like understanding also, like, you're the PhD student postdocs, you also have like kind of a role as a mentor, and
Yes.
but then also managing actually the research projects from the PhD students and the postdocs. So do you have any advice on preparing yourself for a balance between those two roles?
Well, I think actually I loved this question when I saw it on the forum, because I think this gets at a very inherent tension in running a lab. We would all like to think as PIs that we are good mentors and that we have the best interests of our trainees. And that I think is true. But the reality also is that trainees are often coming into labs. They might have had previous work experience, but they may not have. They might have come straight from an educational background, undergrad or something like that. And so in some ways, a PI not only has to mentor a trainee to figure out their strengths, figure out their weaknesses, help them discover or articulate their goals and or determine how to achieve those goals, but they may also actually have to help them discover how do they best work, right? Because doing science, and I feel like we don't emphasize this enough, doing science, doing experiments is work. And understanding how you best do your work, whether or not that means that structure is something really important to you, lack of structure is something really important to you, autonomy is something that's really important to you, more guidance is something that's really important to you. Those are all things that people learn in their first few jobs. And for many students working in a lab, either as an undergrad or as a graduate student, and maybe less so for postdocs, this is their first time learning how they work best. And so I do think that PIs should be realistic that when they take on trainees, they are not only mentoring them, but they are managing them. And that might mean consciously articulating, okay, we have to figure out, or you have to figure out, and I need to help you figure out, how do you best work? And I think that too many times people think trainees come in with that awareness or experience already, and they may have in other positions, but because of the self-direction, self-motivation, and autonomy associated with scientific traineeship in the best circumstances, we have to encourage trainees to think deeply about, okay, what's the best way for me to work in this lab, do my experiments, so that I know that I'm doing the best work that I can be doing.
Definitely. But also, it's also, for me, I would say it's also hard to know, like, how much do I help? Like, because like a PhD student or a postdoc, like, especially a PhD student, because I think postdoc, they somehow manage. But for PhD students, it's like sometimes because of cultural differences also, like experiences vary quite a lot. And the question is, how do you manage this particular person, so that they be able to work by themselves at some point? How much help is enough? How much is like, because you could do also their work, but you don't want that because they will never learn. Huh?
Right. But I think that there is a balance between, and I think the reality is that you have to talk with your trainee to find out what that balance looks like.
Yeah, true.
And you have to, one, get that feedback from the trainee so that they get a sense of how they think that they will work. But also sometimes you have to observe the trainee so that you can help that trainee discover aspects of how they work best. Because I think sometimes when somebody is from the outside looking in, they can see things that somebody involved in the work may not be able to see. And and sometimes that person can be wrong. And if they say it like, okay, this is a pattern I am seeing, tell me if you think I'm wrong. But, it seems to me that you work much better when there's a deadline. And you become much more focused if you know that there's a deadline.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true? Do you think that's true? Should we try to set benchmarks for the next set of experiments so that you feel like you've got a certain timeline within which you've got to get this done? And maybe it'll make it easier for you to prioritize experiments and determine what to do next, with the expectation that maybe that level of management is required at the very beginning, and that they will develop that skill on their own. And maybe you articulate that. Maybe you say, like, this is something I noticed. Let's see if this pattern holds up. If this pattern holds up, this might be something useful to keep in mind when you're thinking about what you're doing next. Right? Because quite frankly, the times that I have learned something important about how I work is when somebody else noticed something, told me about it, and I thought to myself, I didn't recognize that about myself, but let's see if that's true. I didn't automatically accept it, right? Because they could be wrong, right? And people love to give you advice and tell you how to do things. And so let's be real. Sometimes they're wrong. But sometimes they were right, and I tested it out. And so I give people that same flexibility. I say, okay, I could be totally wrong here, but I've noticed this pattern. Do you want to try testing this pattern out? And so that's a useful thing, I think, to do. right? And I think also, I mean, yeah, and then that also shifts with time. It shifts with your position. And so, just that encouraging people to be self-aware enough to be like, oh, I do seem to work. I seem to work better when I come in at around 10 or 11 and I leave at like 7, 6 or 7. Maybe that should be the time within when I work. I don't really like coming in at like 8 and leaving at 5. So like those are the things that I think self-awareness and managing can help because of the relative autonomy of this position.
Yes, I do agree. Thanks for the insight.
Hey, Professor Ball. My name is Waleed Mawas. I'm a postdoc at the University of Chicago. It's a pleasure to
Hey,
have
Waleed.
you. So in the context of the things that you were just talking about, all these procedures and exercises to help your team members succeed within their own goals. Sometimes there's like unforeseen problems and things that we don't envision that they will happen. So how do you deal with such hurdles? And first, like, how do you deal with it within yourself? And then how do you communicate it to either the person or the whole team if the problem encompasses the whole team? So, in fact, what I'm trying to get at is what kind of communication strategy do you employ in such a situation?
I think that I'm going to emphasize this over and over again because I think it makes so much of this decision making so much easier to see from the outside is transparency, right? Being honest about competing interests, about inherent tensions in how we do our work. And so being transparent about them so that some of that decision making is so that trainees and people in the lab see some of that decision making in action. I think an important aspect of that is having enough distance from the situation so that you're not taking it personally, because if you're taking it personally, that can affect that transparency and decision making to a place where it doesn't feel fair or equitable, but it can feel personal or targeting, or, depending on the situation, even retaliatory. Right. And so what you want to do is make sure that people understand that when you're making some of these decisions to deal with the setbacks, to deal with unforeseen things that come up, that you're just you're communicating as much as possible some of that decision making that's going into why you're making those decisions. Right. And that quite honestly might mean that people won't agree with you, that you will have to make hard decisions that people either don't approve of or think are the wrong decisions or don't agree with those decisions. And so what you may need to do is take that information and integrate it and either come up with a reason why you think your decision making is still the correct one, or modify it so that it more accurately reflects what's going on in the lab. I think I am a person who is very introverted and very determined to do things on my own. I am very independent, and that is a good and that is a bad thing. And the thing that I have recognized an incredible value in that I would not have predicted, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, is the importance of collaborative decision making. That often there are solutions or ways to talk about or think about problems that I myself do not have or have not considered. And if I relied only on myself to make some of those decisions, especially when those decisions affect other people aside from me, that I'm making those decisions with not enough data, right? Quite frankly. And so I need to create an environment where people feel comfortable telling me what they think are better or different ways of solving this problem, or, overcoming this hurdle. But I also have to recognize that at the end of the day, I am probably the person who has to make the decision. And so I have to reflect back both that I've taken into account people's ideas and insight into this, and that it has informed my decision-making, but fundamentally, I have to be the one responsible for the decision because of, you know, in reference to previous questions, I have to think about the long-term, what's going to happen in the lab long-term, right? So a person in the lab who's going to be there for 3 to 5 years, they're a valuable member of the lab, but their timeline in the lab is not going to be the same timeline that I am imagining. I am thinking about, where is my lab going to be 10, 15, 20 years from now? And so I have to keep that ultimate goal in alignment with whatever conversation we're happening on what may be a short-term goal. Does that answer your question, or do you have more?
Yes, thank you. That was very insightful.
Okay.
I'm
Yeah,
very
I
glad.
actually, oh, sorry.
Yes, sir, go
I
ahead.
have just a very quick like follow-up comment,
Sure.
I guess. So it's very refreshing to hear your perspective, because from the perspective of like a mentee in a lab, I guess I've had a multitude of difficult experience with people who may not have that kind of perspective. So I really wish more people could be like you in that respect. But I guess, okay.
I mean, I should point out, it took me a long time to get there. And, you know, it was only when, like, I would have had one response and I was in a meeting and somebody said, okay, actually, like, can we talk about alternate, like, that is not an easy lesson to learn. And so I completely understand why some people have not learned it yet, but I think it is a valuable lesson to learn.
Yeah.
Sorry to
And-
interrupt.
No, it's okay. I guess just like I'm trying to like I don't know how to ask this, but it's just like in your perspective, right? Your perspective as a mentor, have you ever initiated any kind of like mentor-mentee contract? I know that was like a very common thing for my institution specifically. That could potentially address, people not having that, perspective. But do you use it? And also, what are some of the best practices that you've observed in your experience using it? And then I think you kind of addressed it too, like with the agreement in place, for example, how do you see, for example, your relationship with your graduate student? How do you see it evolve over time?
So we do use mentor-mentee agreements. In fact, it's required by my graduate program. And so it's a template version of a mentor-mentee agreement is available in our grad handbook. And it's a template. So both the PI and the grad student can adjust it to reflect the realities of their relationship. We provided a template because we were concerned that there might be conversations that some students would not initiate on their own, or some questions that students would not initiate on their own, and that there were some questions that PIs would be either reluctant to answer or reluctant to articulate fully. I think the mentor-mentee agreement is important because often when students are joining a grad program, graduate school is dramatically different than undergrad, right? And I think even for postdocs, this is useful because it sets up the management and mentorship expectations. But I think that, for example, when I shifted from undergrad to grad school, I was completely unprepared for the lack of structure and the fact that, and the autonomy. I mean, I love that about the work that we do now, but I was unprepared for it in grad school. And so I think that the mentor-mentee agreement introduces a level of structure and introduces a level of transparency about grad school that some students might not have. I think the other thing that the mentor-mentee agreement should acknowledge is that the mentor-mentee relationship changes with time, right? So when students come to me and they, for example, are rotating in my lab, one of the first questions they ask me is, what's your mentoring style? And I literally am like, my mentoring style is whatever you need, right? If you need to come speak to me once a week, that's my mentoring style. If you're someone who likes to do an experiment, have time to think about it on your own, don't want to talk to me because you want to do that independently, and then come speak to me later, that's okay too. The only requirement I have is that if I haven't seen you in a while, I'm going to want to talk to you, because if I haven't seen you in a while, I'm a little worried that things are not working out, or you're worried about something. And this is when we should be talking. And the reality is that if a student comes to my lab and wants to meet every week, that's great. But probably in their third or the fourth year, they've transitioned to a place where they want to be more independent. They want to be more autonomous. And so they might want to say, okay, I don't think we need to meet every week, because I want to be thinking about my project on my own. And when I talk to you, you're always telling me how to think about my project, right? And so the mentor-mentee agreement not only provides that initial structure, but also, I hope, in that conversation would also provide the recognition that this relationship evolves over time, is going to transition as the graduate student develops expertise, develops experience, develops independence. And so that there is a recognition that because we are working together anywhere from 3 to 5 years, depending on the graduate program, that change is an expected trajectory. And so that we may need to renegotiate what it means for me to be your mentor and for you to be my mentee.
Well, I want to a little bit follow up on that. Thanks a lot. You sounds like a perfect mentor. And as you said, like, you know,
I don't know
undergrads,
about that.
we can ask you mentee, of course, one
Yes.
day. But as you said, young people come in and they don't know, and it's a different structure, especially for grad student, that can slightly be lost. So, and they can be shy to ask you, even you
Yes.
offer them everything. So it might be more, well, maybe not more, but at least having some examples of, or some peer support, some talking to other grad students and everything. And you said you a bit of an introvert yourself. So how can you help those young people to find this peer support group, just to not be shy anymore and navigate their path a bit faster?
I mean, I think grad student cohorts are a really powerful source of that peer support. And so I think building that grad student cohort through some of the grad programs, like the grad classes in that first year, is a powerful thing that I think our program does very well with that recognition. I think also, quite frankly, I think finding that peer support in the lab is really, really important, and developing a community in the lab that often doesn't include the PI. So for example, in my lab, the people in my lab, so my lab has had varying degrees of community over time. Sometimes, you know, they get along really well and they go out together after working, and they get a beer or they get dinner. And sometimes it's been an environment where people come to lab to work, leave, and live their lives outside. And that's what they want, and that's great. Right now it's in a phase where they're very community oriented, and so they're often going out. And I think one thing that I have recognized is that when they're doing that, they should be doing that without me. That I am, I'm a supervisor, I'm a manager, I'm a mentor. I should be fostering some community, and I should be participating in some community, but I should be trying to foster a community that's independent of me, so that they have opportunities to talk amongst themselves about projects, about, things that are going on in the lab, solving problems on their own, so they don't have to always bring them to me, and they can generate that level of independence. And also that they can complain about me, right? Because, again, like, I'm going to make decisions that they may not like. I'm going to handle things in ways that they may not approve of. And it is important for them to feel like they have people with which they can talk about those things. I think, you know, there's this balance between them having this community that's independent of me, and also them understanding that they can come to me if they need to talk to me about handling a situation in the lab that they feel like they can't do on their own. But I have not always been super great at generating that community. And so when it happens in my lab organically and naturally, I try to foster it, and I try to make sure that it's happening in a way where they recognize that they can do these things and I don't need to be there, because that's an important component of their community. And so, you know, that was super important when I was in grad school. My lab was like an important part of how I felt supported in grad school, in addition to the friends in my grad student cohort. And that was hugely important as a postdoc, because as a postdoc, you often don't have access to, you know, a larger cohort of people. You often come in as an individual. You work in a lab as an individual. There's often not a cohort that you come in with. And so generating that community in that lab and fostering that sense of community in that lab, I think, is an important way to generate that peer support network.
Yeah, that's actually very true, and it reminded me of my PhD time. We had a tea stall outside,
Yep.
Outside of my institute in India, and very often we used to go for tea, and we call it like a therapy, or let's say
Yep.
tea therapy. You go together, gossip about your PIs or experiments or failed experiments. Yeah, it was quite a supporting group, and it really helps. But on the same term, I have my next question, which is about another fact which I'm personally realizing talking to my peers in past few years, that people, especially when they are postdoc or when they are maturing during their career phase, they often feel mentorship vacuum.
Yes.
And this vacuum is not because that their PI is not doing the job, but there are certain conflict of interest, and then these discussion and questions you can't do with your PIs. How do you see this mentorship vacuum to be filled? Do you have any advice on that?
I think if you're coming in as a postdoc, you're filling that mentorship vacuum is even harder, because so for grad students, you often have a thesis committee. You often have access to hopefully a grad advising committee. You have access to other like student-facing organizations that might be useful. And so I think this is could be particularly hard for postdocs. So the first thing I would probably say is that your PI has to be aware of this. Your PI has to recognize that they have limitations in their mentorship skills. And so they have to articulate to the postdocs in their lab, look, I'm going to try as hard as I can to be the mentor that you need to be, but I am one person and I will not be everything that you need. Right? I think this is going to sound a little weird, but I think we think about mentorship relationships the same way we think about romantic relationships. Like we think that there's like this one person who's going to like give us everything we need. And we know that that's not true romantically, right? There's your romantic partner, or, you know, depending on if you are in a romantic relationship, and then there's your friends, right? And you need both. And so I think what you need to think about mentorship is the same, like it's a little, I mean, that analogy is like breaks down in lots of ways. And so it's a little shitty, and I apologize. But I do think that we need to be realistic that that your formal research mentor is not going to be able to provide you with all the mentorship that you need. And that person should be aware of that. And that person should have conversations with you about what you think you need and what you think your career goals are. And then that person should either put you in contact with a network that might provide those alternative mentors or those additional mentors, and or access their own network to do that, right?
Yeah.
The person who is your research mentor has come up through a training trajectory with lots of other people, some of which have stayed in academia, some of which have not, some of which you know, have taken different career paths. And so in some ways, their network would be, you know, a useful starting place for you to start looking for alternative mentors. And so the
Yeah.
person who, you know, they went to grad school with and turned out to be a science communicator instead of staying in academia, or,
Right.
you know, if those are the things, and this is actually why, I don't know if any of y'all are on LinkedIn.
Yeah, all of us.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think PIs on LinkedIn, I think often PIs don't think of LinkedIn as a valuable resource, and it may not be a valuable resource for them, but it's a valuable resource for their trainees. Because
Mm.
everyone that they came up with in grad school and in postdocs is a potential mentor for someone in your lab if that person doesn't want to stay in academia.
Yeah, that sounds absolutely right to me. Yeah.
And
Actually,
so,
one of
go
my
ahead.
collaborators recently recommended his postdoc to connect with me on LinkedIn, and then we had a Zoom call to discuss how easy it is to transit from academic life to industry and corporate science.
Right.
Yeah. Mm.
Right. And so if you set up a LinkedIn, reach out to people that you trained with, and then when someone comes in your lab, say, okay, connect with me on LinkedIn, look through some of my contacts. Are any of those contacts people that you think might be useful for you to speak to? And then your PI can be the go-between to reach out to that person and say, hey, I have a postdoc in my lab who's interested in talking to you, you know, briefly about this, or this. Do you mind speaking to them for 15 or 20 minutes by Zoom? You know, and often people are really excited to talk about their career path. They're really excited to talk about the decisions that they made and how they made those decisions. And so I think that is a useful way for LinkedIn to become this opportunity to identify these alternative mentors.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Professor, I wanted to go back to a conversation you were having when you were mentioning, putting in the time and the effort with your student to help them kind of uh, uh, get at their own weaknesses and strengths. Um, and so I would think that, you know, as a PI, you must have went through the same process figuring out what your own strengths and weaknesses are. So can you help us understand, how did you go about exploring these sides of yourself? How did you get to a point where you were able to lean on those strengths after identifying them, and then work with the weaknesses that you're got to a point where you could accept about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think I made a lot of mistakes when I was getting trained. I made a joke to my graduate PI that um, you know, I was, I think if you asked my graduate PI if I was going to become a PI, he would have been like, no. It took me a long time to figure out how I was the most effective, how I worked most effectively. And quite frankly, the thing that I love about graduate school and postdocs is that you have that flexibility to do that, right? You do have that flexibility to be like, okay, I am not a morning person. I am not going to be in lab at like 8:30 in the morning. Like even now, I have kids. I have to be up. My kids are out the door at 8. I am still, you know, it takes me a little while to get started in the morning. And so I think I think an important thing is recognizing these things about yourself. And two, if it doesn't fit what somebody else told you about how you need to be, that is okay. I think we have preconceptions of what it means to be successful, of what it means to be hardworking, of what it means to be dedicated, of what it means to be passionate. And the reality is that there are lots of different ways to be those things and not one way. And I think the thing that is hardest about academia is that everyone is convinced their way is the only way to be successful. And so that's what they impart to their trainees, to the wider world. And there isn't this recognition that there's actually a diversity of ways to be successful. And the easiest way for you to be successful is to find out what works for you. And so I think probably the flexibility I had as a grad student, the flexibility I had as a postdoc, quite frankly, the recognition that I had that I might not be a PI and that would be okay, but I would figure out something to do. But what I was doing right now was working for me. That flexibility let me figure out what worked for me and how I best worked. And, when there were times that I worked really, really hard, what that looked like. And when there were times that I needed to take a break, what that looked like. And also, quite frankly, the recognition that often the times I got my best ideas, the times that I had a breakthrough, were the times when I was not working really, really hard. It was the times when I thought I was taking a break, but there was this thing in the back of my mind that was still stuck on this problem. And because I had given myself a little freedom and a little flexibility and a little time away from the bench, I had figured out a way to solve that problem. And once again, I'm going to say this over and over again, because I absolutely think it benefits people to spend the time to do this, is to give yourself space and time to become aware of why you're doing something, how you're doing something, and why or why not it is working. Because if you have that self-awareness, that decision-making becomes much easier. That transparency, if you have to incorporate other people's decision-making into it, makes it much easier. And it makes it much easier for you to justify why you're doing something one way or another, right? You're not just doing it because you were told to do it. You're not just doing it because that's the way we've always had it done. You're doing it because you know it is the way that works best for you. And you know that is the way you're going to be able to get this job done, right? And that's ultimately what we all want. We all want to be working at something that we enjoy and that we accomplish and that we finish in a way that feels satisfying and with a sense of accomplishment. And knowing what that looks like for you is an important part of being able to determine, how you're going to do it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
That is actually a nice transition to my next question, because I think you also realized that when you started your lab, then you deal with a small amount of people, I guess, and then your team got bigger, and that means you need to get more experience, need to figure out more. So what is your actual advice how to navigate bigger teams and how to actually, with a bigger team, meaning also allocation of resources, being it personal, monetary, or scientific, that must be quite challenging in the first
Yeah. I had a small team for a very long time, and then I had a bigger team for a while. And it was great having a bigger team because there was enough overlap in expertise and experience and in timing, right? You always sort of want to have this timing work out where people overlap in expertise so that you feel like you're not losing information or institutional memory in the lab. And so that when I had a large group, that was the reality. But I also sort of realized that I don't like having a very large group. When I have a very large group, I have to assume a level of independence for people in my lab. And sometimes I can assume that, and sometimes I can't, right? If I have postdocs in my lab, that might make it easier. But more often than not, I mostly have grad students in my lab. And the level of training and the level of involvement with grad students is very different than for postdocs. And so my experience is that the allocation of resources, whether it's time, money, or, you know, access to resources or something like that. The most important of all of those three is time. Like, I don't like to allocate resources inequitably in my lab. I don't like to allocate funding inequitably in my lab. I might have to do that sometimes just because of the reality of where those funding sources are, but I don't like to do it, and I would prefer not to. And the most important resource I have is time. And so when I think about the size of my lab, I think about mostly how many people can I support so that I feel like they are getting the mentorship that they want and need. And that might vary depending on if they're postdocs and if they're grad students. My expectations for postdocs are very different than my expectations for grad students. My expectations for postdocs is a level of independence, a level of autonomy, and a level of self-motivation and direction that I think I can't assume for grad students. And so that's probably how I think about the allocation of resources, with the recognition that my time is the most important resource that I have.
I really like that you already mentioned this, and yeah, related question. So we know that the current structure of the scientific enterprise is heavily reliant on human components. So of course, we're all human, we're all different. How we can generate idea, how can we be productive and give us something. But again, as you said, as I said, we're all different. We have different background. We have different identities, and that's who we are, and that's what makes us human. But again, as a leader, you need to judge performance. So what type of strategies or techniques, or how do you do it really to make sure that you're fair to everyone and you can judge their performance fairly?
I think the thing that is the most important here is their performance going to get them their goals? Right? And so when I'm judging someone's performance, I mean, the thing about being a trainee is that at the end of the day, their trainees are responsible for their career on some fundamental level, right? Yes, you know, I'm going to put a lot of caveats there. Yes, you know, I will support them financially. Yes, I will support their mentorship. Yes, I will manage them when that's necessary. Yes, I will provide them access to networks so that they can get what they need. But at the end of the PhD reflects the work that the trainee put, and, you know, at the end of the postdoc, it reflects the work that they put into their scientific work. And my hope is that those two things align so that it aligns with my expectations. But maybe my expectations also have to change, right? And so I think there has to be constant communication about my expectations, where those expectations come from, right? Like, I have to be aware of the fact that in order to keep my lab funded, you know, we have to communicate our science. We have to contribute to the field. What does that look like? I would like that to look exactly the same for all my trainees, but I don't know if that's going to be true, right? So that's a reality that I have to deal with. And so I have to figure out how to equitably assess the performance of someone in my lab, align that performance so that they can get what they want post-training, articulate to them, at the end of the day, your training is going to look like the work you put into it. What is that? What do you want that to look like? And think about how that fits in the larger scheme of what do we communicate to our field? What do we communicate to funding agencies? how do I make sure that this lab stays funded? Right. And sometimes that's easier said than done. Sometimes that's, hard. Sometimes that's hard conversations with people in my lab. And again, I think transparency is an important aspect of this. I have to say, like, look, there are competing interests here. How do you want to handle this? Because this is what I'm worried about. What are you worried about? Like, how are we going to do this? And, it's just, and sometimes I mess up, and sometimes I don't handle it in the best way. And sometimes they don't handle it in the best way, but hopefully we have enough open communication that we can recognize that we didn't handle it in the best way. We can apologize to each other and we can move on to figure out what the next course of action is.
That sounds really refreshing and really appreciate your perspective. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to ask a last question. Honestly, in my opinion, the academic culture thus far is still quite monotonous, even if so many of us are kind of pushing to develop more diversity in leadership that are running these institutions where we do research. And just coming from the viewpoint of being a person of color in America, despite the rise in leadership for folks with more diverse backgrounds, we are still seeing more than our fair share of just Caucasian male in their 50s or 60s who graduate from Ivy League that are in leadership positions at like premier universities in the country or the world even, but let's just focus on America for now. So to me, this everlasting pattern just seems to bring kind of like bias in leadership, in terms of like our day-to-day, even in terms of how you as a mentor can operate in your,
Yes.
toolbox. So do you see the need for more types of leadership models, skills, etc.? And how do you see us come from here in terms of like the next 5 to 10 years in this leadership part?
So it is super interesting that you're asking that question right now, because I think the reality is, because I think right now we're experiencing a backlash, quite honestly. I think that there was like a couple of years where people were like, maybe this could be interesting. What? And now we're seeing a backlash. I think we're seeing that in multiple spheres and arenas in the United States, and quite honestly, in Europe and in other parts of this country and other parts of this world too, right? I think that what we're seeing is a sense that there's a lack of resources. I don't agree with that. That there is this scarcity, and therefore that scarcity necessitates a level of hyper competition, and that hyper competition is going to select for the people who are the most homogenous and the most aligned with expected definitions of success. We're seeing that in America with science. We're seeing that with America with lots of other spheres. We're seeing that in Europe. And I think, quite frankly, I think an inability to name it, white supremacy, is blocking our ability to have an honest conversation about what needs to change. I think we have to have a systems understanding of how status, competition, esteem, and expertise is valued. And that's not limited to academia, that we have to have a systems understanding of how these things interrelate and how it gets replicated in academia. And I think that can happen on large scales. And I think it can happen on small scales, like institutions, large scales when we have bigger conversations about academia. And maybe that's with scientific societies and larger institutions that talk more directly about scientific fields. But I think we have to be honest about what we're talking about. We're talking about a system that rewards whiteness, that rewards maleness, and that has produced a system that is, quite frankly, a pale shadow of what it could be. That we could have a better version of science. We could have a better version of academia if we were truly meritocratic. And that creates a level of insecurity in some people, and they would like to keep it the way it is. And so, you know, I really just think that those of us who see this systems level understanding, those of us who see that this is not working, and those of us who have power, I'm not asking grad students and postdocs to do this, have to be able to articulate that we are doing a disservice to science and our trainees by maintaining this level of homogeneity. And that it is fueled by insecurity. It is fueled by a sense that this is how we have always done it, and it is wrong. And so naming the problem, I think, is an important part of it. And being honest about the problem in a way that recognizes that this will actually make science better for everyone. Nobody loses when we make science and academia more equitable, more diverse, and more representative of the people it's meant to serve. Right? And so, you know, I think that like the number of times that a student has expressed to me that they don't want to be identified or associated with a diversity incentive or a diversity program because they think that negates their expertise or their training, and the number of times I want to remind them that that is not a reflection of their expertise. It is not a reflection of their skill. It is not a reflection of their training. It is not a reflection of their possibility. It is not a reflection of their future. It is a reflection of the insecurity of a group of people who are worried about losing power.
Yeah.
And that has to be the recognition that we impart, right? That people want to maintain power, and they are going to make you feel like crap to maintain that power. And so if you recognize that that has more to do with them, their insecurity, than it has to do with your expertise, like they're the sad person. They're the one where their insecurity is fueling their behavior. You're going to be fine.
That's very motivating to hear. And of course, as you can see, this subcommittee, for instance, we are true representation of science. And
Yes.
actually our small community, GSA ECLP community, is quite aware of that, and we always encourage this diversity, especially in terms of ECLP representation, and also the guests we invite to this talk series. But I mean, we can keep talking about your experiences for next one more hour, because we all are quite enjoying it. But at some point, we need to say that, yeah, we need to stop the recording. And thank you for being so brave and honest with us, because I'm sure this is going to inspire so many of us, so many early career researchers and researchers who want to develop themselves into a good leader, of course, to look at the leadership model. They want to look away from the typical mindset of looking at the white guy with publications and credentials, but not being good at managing or
Yes.
leading a team. Yeah. So thanks again, Needhi, for all
don't
the
worry about it.
insightful discussion.
I hope this was useful, and I hope if there's anything that you want to correct or change, please let me know.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
I hope I didn't curse too much. I'm always a little worried about that. Okay.
Yeah, it was wonderful to talk to you, and we are excited to see you at the next GSA event also. That's because you are going to be one of the keynote speaker probably there.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. We are
Yeah,
really looking
I'm a
forward
little
to that.
nervous about that, quite honestly.
Yeah.
And I also, can I just say that
Yeah.
this is such, first of all, these questions were amazing.
Mm.
And this is such a great idea. So major props for coming up with this idea and doing all of this work. And I am so honored to be a part of this work because I'm so impressed.
Yeah, it's all teamwork, especially it's also big motivation and support that we get from GSA.
Yes.
And yeah, so it's good to acknowledge them right now and forever.
But
Yeah.
also you, Kausha, it was your idea. It was your proposal. So thanks, Kausha, and thanks for leading this.
Well, and also
initiative.
thanks. Yeah. And thanks to all of you for I mean, I feel like we underestimate the amount of work implementing these things are. You deserve major, major props for bringing this into reality. You should all be super proud of yourselves. I am super proud.
Oh, thanks. Really.